Hi everyone, I'm Nate Graff. I'm the Hardware Outreach Officer, elected for the second time running.
How many opponents did you face? Huh? How many opponents did you face?
0. So anyway, I'm here to talk about hardware authentication tokens, which for the most part means smart cards. Pretty much any credit card-like object that has a CPU built into it. So in order to talk about hardware authentication tokens, I want to do a quick overview of what authentication means. And so when you're authenticating yourself to someone or something, you typically want to present one of these 4 different kinds of proofs of identity. And so these are something I know, something I have, something I am, and something I do are generally the 4 categories of authentication that we cover. And so things that these might be are passwords. So you know your password, and hopefully no one else knows your password. You have your car key, and hopefully no one else has your car key. You are your fingerprint. We generally consider any biometric data about your physical person to be who you are, not just because it's something that you can't change, but because it's something that's just intrinsically you and hopefully no one else. And something you do is like a secret handshake, some series of actions that only you know. And I also want to talk about certificates, because certificates are a big part of authenticating yourself with hardware authentication tokens. Certificates in general are something we use all the time, like your driver's license, or your passport, or your degree. Your driver's license, for example, certifies that you know how to drive a car in a given state, or at least you passed a very short test that tested nothing about how you can drive. It also, for some purposes, guarantees that you're capable of drinking, so who knows about that. And so important properties of certificates are that, first of all, it certifies something. There's something in particular that it says about you and the certificate holder. And it's also important that the certificated possesses the certificate. A certificate is something that you can take from the certificate issuer and go out into the world and say, yes, this certificate proves something about me. It identifies both the certifier and the certificated, so that you know who to go ask to make sure that the certificate is real, and you know that the certificate applies to Joe instead of Bob, stuff like that. And one of the most important parts of certificates is that they're at least difficult or preferably impossible to forge or modify, so that you can't just make up your own certificate and say, oh yeah, you could totally go ask Alice down the road that this is her certificate, and you can't know for sure. There's some important questions that you have to ask about pretty much any certificate though, and that's, how is their certificate stored? Is it a piece of paper that I can just scan in a scanner and print out again? Or is it some kind of sequence of bytes that I'm storing in my computer that have some cryptography involved in order to do the actual verification process? You also want to know how their certificates are issued. Is someone just sitting in an office handing out certificates willy-nilly? Can you generate your own certificates and sign them yourself and say, yeah, this is totally valid? Or is there some organization that has some trust instilled by it, by a group of people, that is doing due diligence in order to issue certificates? You also want to know what the tamper resistance protections are, and especially what the cost to circumvent that tamper resistance is. Because even if it's difficult to circumvent tamper resistance, if the value you gain from circumventing it is far greater than the cost to circumvent it, then you might as well just make it easy to circumvent anyway, because someone's going to do it in order to get that value. So moving on to the actual hardware. Smart cards are things that look like that, and things that act like things that look like that. So inside that card is a small microprocessor, and it's usually embedded immediately underneath the gold contacts on the card. And the gold contacts are precisely gold contacts, which make electrical connection with the device that interacts with the smart card. And pretty much anything that doesn't solely depend on Magstripe, like traditional credit cards, is usually some standard having to do with smart cards. It's one of the few cases where I think we've done a relatively good job of making electrical contacts pretty consistent. So these are what the electrical contacts look like and label of what the actual pins are. You have your typical pinout you see for any integrated circuit. So you have the VCC, the power, you have ground, which is not the power, you have reset and a clock line, and there's always a dedicated I/O line, which is half-duplex, meaning that the reader can, no matter what the standard is, there is at least one pin that allows you to send information to the card and then receive information back. And half-duplex specifically means that it can only go one way at a time. Some wire protocols allow you to send information both ways simultaneously. This isn't C7, but C4 and C8, which can change depending on the standard, might have different I/O lines associated with them. VPP right there is a programming voltage, which allows you to configure which allows you to add a higher voltage to the chip in order to configure the chip. We had a question?
You said that it's half duplex. Is there a pin that like you can pull up on that, or is it just determined through software?
I'm not entirely sure. It's something that would probably be very standard dependent, and it's a level of detail that I didn't get into when going through all the different kinds of smart cards for this talk. Yeah, so smart cards are usually read with some kind of piece of hardware, often connected over USB. And I chose this picture because the card on it says, "Smarten yourself," which is just funny. You can also find really small smart card readers, which can be portable and plug into a laptop. Certain laptop models, especially those that are designed for enterprise, have smart card readers built into them. And you can also find things like keyboards that have a smart card reader built into them, or many devices just have smart card functionality. Contactless smart cards are also often found, and so that's where the smart card has a coil built into it, which when you put it near the reader sends out a 13.56 megahertz RF signal, and that resonates with the coil. And the card can then take that resonant energy, convert it into DC voltage, power the chip on it, and then use that same antenna to send information back. And so one thing is that at least one of the specifications for this contactless smart card is supposed to only work at up to 10 centimeters, but because it uses radio and you can just buy a nicer antenna, there are attacks that have been demonstrated where someone has a smart card in their wallet and you just put out an antenna on the wall, and as they're walking past, then you just scan the card because it responds to any of the proper RF communication. Now, as to whether the protocol that's implemented over that RF requires some sort of authentication from the reader, that's its own protocol. But the smart cards, and especially passive RFID tags, are vulnerable to interception just walking around, which is partly why my own wallet has an integrated mesh, which acts like a Faraday cage. So the first smart card standard I'd like to talk about is FIPS 201, which is the personal identity verification standard used by the US federal government for identifying employees. And what's important about FIPS 201 is that it provides 3 forms of identification for identifying individual employees. So the first thing is that possession of the card provides something you have. If someone steals your employee card, that's a bad thing, because the card itself is part of what authenticates you. The other thing is the card stores a PIN number, which if you type into the card scanner when you sign into a government facility, is verified by the card and essentially unlocks the card and allows access to some more of the data on it. The third thing is that the card stores biometric data about the individual, which means that the card can verify things about who you are, and the person working at the verification desk or whatever can check that, say, the picture on the card and store it inside the card actually is the person standing in front of them. The card also serves as a printed human readable ID, just like a driver's license. So actually, that's a generic sample of what these cards look like. So it has the photo, the agency, the expiry date, the name, a barcode that can be scanned for that. The smart card chip is right there in the usual place so that when you insert the card, it can be interacted with by the card reader. And The biometric data that the card stores is 2 fingerprints and the image printed on the card. That biometric data is cryptographically signed by the card issuer, so that if someone tried to modify the data on the card, it would no longer pass a signature check. And that data is only provided after a successful PIN entry, so that third factor of authentication only applies after the person has gone through the first 2 factors of authentication. You can't just steal someone's fingerprints off a card you find laying on the ground.
And I'm guessing that there's cryptographic stuff going on about it, but I can't read the PIN off the card too.
The standard for FIPS 201, the first document I found was 97 pages, and there were a couple more documents on that. So there are pages upon pages of protocol that go into exactly how these devices function. So the cryptographic verification methods on the card are also that every employee gets their own asymmetric private key, and that employee's identity is also certified by an X509 certificate stored on the card, which again is retrievable as part of the authentication process. Just as a quick aside, X509 is a digital certificate standard, and it's the one used by SSL and TLS for identifying websites. And X509 specifically stores not just the public key of the person or site or entity being identified, but information about that that individual's identity, the signature of the certificate authority or whatever issuer created the certificate, and metadata about when the certificate expires and things like that. So the FIPS 201 card has an X509 certificate issued by the US federal government for each and every federal employee that has a PIV card. Another standard is OpenPGP card. And this is one of my favorite smart card standards just because it's really interesting to think about the fact that you have this piece of plastic that is computing asymmetric key signatures and decryption. So the way the OpenPGP card standard works is you have a smart card and you load your private key onto the card, and once it's loaded, the key can't be extracted from the card. Now, that can't be extracted as in it's not designed to be extractable, but one of my areas of research is in side channel attacks, and especially because the card is powered by whoever is powering it, smart cards are particularly vulnerable, potentially, to side channel attacks that allow you to extract information from the device without, basically through the power consumption is specifically what the attack is against OpenPGP cards. And like I said, the card itself performs the on-card signing and decryption. So if we go over the actual control flow for PGP, essentially you have the data that you're encrypting, and in order to encrypt that data, you generate a random symmetric key, and you encrypt that data with the symmetric key, and then use the recipient's public key to encrypt the symmetric key. And this is because asymmetric key encryption is really expensive. And so instead of encrypting kilobytes, potentially megabytes to gigabytes of data asymmetrically, you encrypt the key to that and then encrypt the key asymmetrically. And that is what allows the asymmetric encryption of the document. Once you've sent the document, usually with PGP, the recipient takes the encrypted data, takes the encrypted key, and then decrypts that key with their own private key, and then decrypts that data with the decrypted symmetric key. What the OpenPGP card standard allows is taking this key decryption, which depends on your private key, which is supposed to remain secret at all costs, and it offloads that onto the smart card, meaning that if someone has compromised the computer that is performing the decryption, the compromise only affects that single message. It doesn't leak the entire key. And so when this allows the decryption of documents with PGP or signing of documents with PGP as well without potentially leaking the key that's used to actually do the private secret key action. So I want to talk also a lot about payment cards. And so the traditional credit card was a Magstripe credit card, and this is where you have that black line on the credit card that has the information in it. And so that black line stores bits of information in the magnetism of that strip. And there are actually 2 different tracks of data in that strip, and they're both encoded differently. There's actually room for a third one, but I don't think, to the best of my research, no one's ever used it for anything. There's just room for it if they wanted to expand into it. And there are 2 tracks of data, partly to provide redundancy against one of the tracks being damaged. But the protocol allows the point of sale device to choose which track it can read, which can be potentially valuable because the lines are really small. And so if you have a really cheap card reader, you might choose the larger lines just because it's potentially more reliable. The first track stores alphanumeric data, so it can store letters and numbers. And the first track contains card number, the cardholder's name, the expiration date of the card, processing codes for how to handle that card, and various other discretionary data at the behest of the card issuer. Track 2 only stores numeric data, and that's why the encoding is different. And so this stores all the information on track 1 except for the card issuer, the card holder's name. And one of the biggest limitations of Magstripe credit cards is that the information is provided right there in plain text. There's absolutely no cryptographic verification of the data. And so traditionally what was done to verify transactions with Magstripe credit cards is that the point of sale device phoned home to the credit card company to verify that the data was right and approve the transaction. And one of the biggest difficulties with this is that especially in the time before Wi-Fi was prevalent, often the card would be taken away from the card holder over to the point of sale device out of view of the customer, where a potentially malicious employee could just copy the data on the card and then go use it. Because all that was required to verify a transaction with a credit card was the card number and potentially information about the expiration date and card holder name. And so Magstripe credit cards were pretty terrible against a determined attacker wanting to commit credit card fraud. And so that's one of the reasons that the industry has moved on to EMV credit cards. And EMV is a chip card, and it stands for Europay, MasterCard, and Visa, who were the original companies that wanted to design the standard. One of the biggest things that EMV provides is the fact that the smart card chip is supposed to not be able to be duplicated. As with any attack, how much money do you have? But the biggest thing is that the card company can require the card holder to be present for the transaction, especially in Europe where they use chip and pin authentication, where just like your debit card, when you use it, you have to input a pin. In Europe especially, your credit card also has a 4 to 6 digit pin that's required to authenticate your transaction. In the US, we've mostly stayed to the chip and signature method, which is just as well because one of the big findings in the last, actually that was 7 years ago, one of the big findings in 2010 was that the chip and the pin security could be authenticated by a malicious man-in-the-middle attack at a given POS device. Researchers were able to both intercept the pin and therefore not make it secret anymore. Something you know is now something other people know. And they were also able to perform a downgrade attack where the card authentication didn't even want a pin, or you could type in any pin at all and the authentication would pass. One of the big problems with EMV credit cards, though, is that the way they designed the specification was for every single issuer of EMV credit cards to get their own smart card application. And this means every card issuer gets their own smart card standard. And so that obviously causes a problem with interoperability and is one of the big reasons that rollout was so slow, especially in the United States. The transaction is also really slow because the steps for actually performing the protocol is that the card, your credit card, tells the point of sale device what steps to follow. And also the point of sale device and the card negotiate the actual verification method that happens, because certain point of sale devices might not be able to implement certain verification steps, like a signature there might not be a place for a signature, or the signature might happen on the receipt. And so the card not only dictates the protocol, but gets to negotiate with the point of sale to define what an acceptable transaction is.
So could someone malicious just like make a card that tells it, oh yeah, you don't have to do any steps?
I mean, I would need to know more about the standard, and this is so impenetrable that I spent most of my time on this, and I don't know too much more than this.
Is that part of the, like, it is hard for people to create these who are not us?
Yeah, there might be something having to do with you can only create a smart card application if you have enough money. As to more, it might just not be, there might just be a significant R&D cost to creating a new smart card application. And if anything else, it just adds to the namespace that eventually would get filled up. If you created an infinite number of smart card applications, you'd run out of bits to identify the application. One of the reasons that card issuers really wanted EMV credit cards is that they hoped that requiring something like a PIN number would help offload the responsibility for fraudulent transactions onto the merchants and the cardholders. But because of the vulnerabilities discovered in the PIN process, it hasn't worked too well. Various arguments have been happening in the industry as to exactly who owns the liability. Because obviously, the credit card companies want to lose as little money as possible, and credit card fraud is one way that they do lose money. Moving on with more payment methods, there are a bunch of different standards that companies have come up with for using your smartphone to pay. Since I own an iPhone, I researched Apple Pay, but I know Android Pay and Samsung Pay are two other standards. I'll just only be talking about Apple Pay in this presentation. So part of every iPhone is a chip called the secure element. And the secure element in particular is an embedded microcontroller, which is compatible with the Java card standard. And the Java card standard is just a smart card that is able to run Java micro applets, which is a subset of the Java language, that's pretty fun. And so that secure element in an iPhone is the central controller for processing Apple Pay transactions. And one really neat thing about it is that the NFC antenna on your iPhone gets connected directly to that secure element, and the POS device interacts directly with the secure element within your phone, bypassing the application processor. And so when you add a card to Apple Pay, every combination of device and credit cards, so if you have multiple phones or stuff of that nature, every time you add a given card to your phone, the card issuer agrees with you on what device account number to associate with that card. And that device account number is stored encrypted in the secure element on your iPhone. And the whole idea is Apple at least claims that that device account number, and especially the credit card number associated with that account, isn't available to Apple. And the credit card number associated with that device account number isn't ever given to the merchant. So the merchant performs the transaction with the device account number and never finds out your credit card number, which, because the transaction can go through if you know the credit card number, is one way that they've improved the security of credit card transactions with Apple Pay. So the transaction process for Apple Pay is first that the user authenticates their iPhone, usually with the PIN number or Touch ID. And then the phone communicates with the point of sale device to transfer the device account number and a unique random code that is associated specifically with that transaction. So even if the merchant tries to forge a transaction with your device account number, that transaction unique code will no longer be valid. And that transaction unique code is derived both from random numbers from both the phone and the point of sale device, and from a transaction counter, which is incremented after every transaction. So moving on from payment methods, SIM cards are also a smart card. And you might have noticed that the contacts on a SIM card look a lot like other smart cards, if you've ever seen a smart card and a SIM card in the same place. And so SIM stands for Subscriber Identity Module. And so SIM cards go back to pure authentication. A SIM card authenticates you to the mobile network and identifies not only the SIM card and its unique SIM card identifier, but the international mobile subscriber identity tied to your phone account. And also stores a 128-bit symmetric key, which is used for authenticating yourself to the GSM network. This might be a little out of date. The Wikipedia page for SIM cards only mentions GSM. Because this is embedded technology, there have been attacks demonstrated throughout the past of extracting that 128-bit symmetric key from the SIM card and duplicating a SIM card by programming a new card with that same symmetric key.
So is there one symmetric key for every SIM card? Or is it like just a shared, like my provider puts their...
I'm not sure exactly how that key is agreed upon. I'd imagine that the protocol is designed such that the key is rotatable. So YubiKey is all of the above, many of the above. So a YubiKey is a USB stick which implements a lot of the protocols we've already talked about and a couple more. By the way, Kent right here has a YubiKey on him, and has agreed to show people his YubiKey if anyone is interested in seeing one in person. I imagine you would not want anyone to plug it into their laptop. So YubiKey implements a number of protocols. First is static password storage. So if you just want to not remember a password, you can program your YubiKey with it. And then that yellow dot is actually a button. And so all of these protocols usually have some sort of physical user interaction with the button. So when you press that button, you can configure the YubiKey to just type in the password over a USB human interface device. It also implements Oath, which is HOTP and TOTP, which Nick Frost talked about last week. I'll be going over them again so that we have at least a refresher or a complete new go-over for people who weren't here last week. YubiKey also has their own proprietary one-time password algorithm, which we'll go over exactly what benefits it provides. It also acts like a FIPS 201 personal identification device. So contractors can use it as in place of their, or entities can choose to use it instead of a smart card for PIV. It can work with OpenPGP card, and it has its own new universal two-factor algorithm called FIDO U2F. So we'll start with Oath and HOTP in particular. HOTP stands for HMAC-based one-time password. And the whole idea here is usually with some other form of authentication, you also are prompted to enter your one-time password, which is dynamically regenerated every time you log in. And the way HOTP generates this authentication token is by HMACing the counter of authentication token generations with a secret key, and then truncating the result of that HMAC operation to the last bits there, not digits, the last 31 bits. And 31 because it's truncating the 32 and then making it unsigned. So it just deletes the 32nd digit and you have 31 bits of binary number. And one of the big deals about HOTP versus TOTP is that there's no time-based expiration on HOTP tokens. And every time you generate a new HTTP token, that's valid until you use it to authenticate, at which point it invalidates that token and every token that could have come before it. TOTP, on the other hand, is a time-based one-time password. And much like HOTP, it still uses an HMAC, but instead of HMACing a timer or a counter, it HMACs the current time rounded to the nearest n seconds. Most TOTP implementations I've seen use the nearest 30 seconds to generate a new token. I use TOTP as a second factor of authentication for a lot of the services I use with the Google Authenticator app. And the most important difference is, like I said, TOTP codes expire outside of the defined window.
So where does it get the time from? Is the current system? Especially like the YubiKeys is pulled from the system.
Yeah, so the YubiKey doesn't have a clock on board, so the app on the computer, which is interacting with the YubiKey, has to provide the YubiKey with the current time.
So is it theoretically possible for me to plug in my own computer, advance the time?
Yeah, but since you're authenticating yourself to a remote service, that service is going to have a different time.
But then wait and then use it on the service in the future.
That is possible. So you'd want to, if you're using TOTP with your YubiKey, you'd want to make sure that you maintain it in your possession, because it's possible that they've engineered the YubiKey to not allow you to use TOTP unless you have an authenticated applet on the computer you plug the YubiKey into. But there is a potential for a YubiKey to be stolen, used to generate a future TOTP token, and then given back before its loss is noted, then logged in as a second factor in the future. Which is one of the reasons why YubiKey, like I said, YubiKeys don't have an onboarding slot, which is one of the reasons why YubiKey implemented their own one-time password algorithm. And the main difference, at least cryptographically, is that YubiKey uses a symmetric key encryption algorithm instead of an HMAC. And so the way the Yubico OTP works is the YubiKey has a unique identifier. And when it generates a token, it prepends that unique identifier onto the token and then sends that token to the server. The server then uses that unique token to look up the user's symmetric key, then decrypts the rest of that token to get the shared secret between the key and the server, and a counter to validate that the token hasn't been used already. Yubico promotes this as a one-time password service that they can provide to their customers. And so the server stores the AES key, and that, the other big difference between TOTP, HTTP, and Yubico OTP is that the resulting one-time password is 44 characters long instead of 6 to 10 digits long. That's decimal digits in this case. Lastly, the YubiKey implements FIDO U2F, which is an asymmetric key-based one-time password algorithm. And it's been developed by Google, Yubico, and NXP Semiconductors. The main way the algorithm works is that the authenticating server sends a challenge to the user, which then prompts their U2F device to sign that prompt and return it to the server as a proof of identity. So the YubiKey stores a private key, and the authentication client requests a signature from the YubiKey. One big thing is that the YubiKeys, which implement NFC technology, allow you to use this two-factor service with a tablet or phone, which also you have NFC. So instead of having to plug in the YubiKey to your laptop and getting the one-time password from there and then figuring out how to type it into your phone, you can tap the YubiKey on your phone or tablet and have it process the signature and back without having to type anything in.
What's the range of NFCs? Is it also multiple so I can be walking past you and stealing it?
Because this is a signature-based one-time password algorithm, and believe me, there's a lot more going on just in this diagram. I pulled the simplest off. What?
You just get hand back the signature, whatever you hand it.
Yeah. So and believe me, there is definitely authentication for who's giving you something to sign. So if you just tried to walk by someone's YubiKey doing U2F, you wouldn't necessarily get anything useful. So yeah, just to review then, physical tokens are useful primarily because the possession is automatically one factor of authentication. When you're using passwords or other purely data-based authentication methods, it can be a lot easier to steal, especially if you have remote access on the target's computer. Because these methods require physical possession of an object, you have to at least be within the same vicinity as someone to attack them. They're also often useful as a form of multi-factor authentication, and themselves use multi-factor authentication to verify that the right person is interacting with them. And that's with passcode protected or PIN protected like PIV or OpenPGP. They're hopefully designed to be tamper resistant, such that the embedded computation and data storage doesn't leak information or have some way to attack or duplicate the device. And a big thing is that many of the authentication methods implemented by these smart cards are essentially managed, so that because the cryptographic proof of identity are usually only as good as the authority who is trusted to verify and issue those certificates. Questions?
So how much storage is there on like your average smart card, and how often does that fail?
Measured in kilobytes. And failure, I mean, you break the card, you lose it. I'm not too sure about how often you just have random spontaneous failures. I'd imagine the failure rate goes up the more you write to it, especially because as we saw in the pinout, the programming voltage is higher than the usual interaction voltage, and those higher voltages are usually associated with some kind of damage to the device. Just like in SSDs, the more often you use a higher voltage to clear a sector on the device, the more likely that sector is to fail.
So how is the signature verified with chip and signature?
As well as it ever was. You can totally just draw a unicorn on both the card. Actually, that's the other thing is, like, I have never once had anyone actually verify the fact that I don't have a signature on my credit card, because they're not supposed to work unless you have a signature on them. I just have never signed my credit cards. It's always worked. Part of that might be the fact that my Costco credit card has a picture of me on it, which actually is a really great form of two-factor authentication right there.
I mean, can't you get custom credit cards? Can I get one with your face on it?
Yeah, actually, well, that'd be the front of the credit card, which ideally isn't used for authentication.
The process is someone looks at your signature and looks at the back of the card and says, oh, good enough.
Well, yeah, especially because like those point-of-sale devices are often really laggy. So you like scribble something and then it draws half of it.
Not to mention, like, my signature changes on like a minutely basis.
Especially for credit card transactions, it's just bleh.
You mentioned the HTTP, sorry, not HTTP, the passwords. If you authenticate with a password, anything before it, generated before it, be voided?
HTTP is based on a counter of the number of tokens that have been generated and used. So because the server knows so the way that it works on the server side is you take all the possible counts that you might expect from the user, because the user might click the HTTP token generator and accidentally advance the counter. So the server has to pre-calculate the tokens for the next n counters, and then if the user goes past that, then you have to redo a certain handshake in order to resynchronize the counter. Remind me what the question was?
I didn't say that. For TOTP, I know odds are you're not going to do stuff quick enough for it to do have two valid tokens.
I believe certain implementations of TOTP can choose to also authenticate the previous and next time code as well.
So if you were to, like if I were, for example, to grab Ken's YubiKey and click a button a bunch of times and break the YubiKey?
If he used HTTP, he would have to reconfigure the YubiKey if you clicked it enough.
Hey, can I see a feature?
Do you use HTTP?
I actually don't know.
Yes.
Okay. Amazon uses
Is
HTTP?
that midway?
Yeah.
Yes.
What?
Clicking it, what's considered enough?
Whatever the standard says. So part of the thing about HTTP and TOTP is that they're open standards, which means anyone can implement them and then tweak all the knobs all they want. So if your implementation of HTTP, specifically the server's implementation, because the server is who gets to decide whether your token's valid or not. If the server says you only get three possible counter values and then you're not authenticated anymore, then 4 times would be enough. Anything else?
When you were researching this, was there anything that like jumped out as you as like terrifying or anything like that?
Not particularly terrifying, just the amount of effort that would go into properly implementing any one of these technologies is really daunting, which is probably why security engineers get paid a lot. To do it wrong and then fix their mistake. Be on call to fix it.
Did you see any, just because you were researching, did you see any like news on when they're going to phase out the Magstripe? Because it seems like the cards are not really any more secure, considering I can still just steal your Magstripe, make a reproduction card, say it didn't ever have a pin, and then just go to any vendor I want and use the Magstripe.
I didn't see anything about any actual like news articles about that or whatever. My dad has a Target card which doesn't have a Magstripe. So.
An entertaining thing, my bank actually gave out like my default card with only a Magstripe recently.
Only a Magstripe?
Only a Magstripe. Apparently people were complaining about the chip for some reason. I don't know. My mom was just like, yeah, this
I have heard part of the reason they're so slow is not just because of the negotiation, but also because the POS developers are just.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, if you try to implement the spec I've been reading, you'd also be slow about doing it, right? Hence the POS devices here.
It sounds like you're trying to do a cryptographic negotiation between a toaster and a worse toaster. And so I don't really blame them for being slow. Like, you have pretty much zero compute power on one, and a toaster's with compute power on the actual POS, so.
Yeah.
I remember some of the grocery stores were mentioning that they, since they had found so much money on all of the fancy POS systems, they skipped on the backend servers, so the backend servers didn't have.
Oh, they don't have enough bandwidth to handle the requests?
Yeah, and they eventually fixed it and realized they were annoying customers.
So basically, chip and pin isn't web scale.
So, you just need to make a custom MongoDB.
Oh yeah, all the MongoDB. With sharding and everything. That way it just drops all the transactions on the floor.
It's not that database.
Hang out with Chip and Mongo next year.
Any other questions?
If there are chips in it.
You can't have any fraudulent transactions if you don't store any. I had to have a meme eventually. I haven't had any memes in my presentations.
Have you, so recently, like skimmer, like they came out with new like EMV skimmers that have been around for a little while. Did you read about any of that?
No, I didn't have enough time to figure out all the possible attacks and then add another hour. I'd definitely be interested if you knew any papers to send, you could send to me. Neat. Thank you very much.